The handmade rocking chair felt heavier than usual as I carried it up Emily's front steps that rainy Saturday morning. I'd spent 3 weeks crafting it for my grandson's nursery, sanding each curve until it was smooth as silk. The Columbus weather had been terrible all week, but I wasn't going to let a little rain stop me from delivering this gift. Brandon opened the door with his usual scowl, barely glancing at me or my carefully crafted present. "What's that supposed to be?" he muttered, looking at the chair like it was something dirty. Just as I stepped forward to explain the love and hours I'd put into making it, he shoved the door closed with deliberate force. My right hand, still gripping the chair's arm, got caught between the heavy oak door and its wooden frame. The crushing pain shot up my arm like lightning, and I could feel my bones grinding together. I gasped and staggered backward, nearly dropping the chair onto the wet porch. Brandon's face appeared in the doorway again, wearing that familiar smirk I'd grown to hate. "Don't be so dramatic, old man," he said coldly, his eyes showing no concern whatsoever. "Maybe you should watch where you put your hands." Emily rushed into the hallway, her face flushed with panic as she saw me cradling my injured hand. "Dad, what happened?" "Your hand is already turning purple and swelling up." She reached for me instinctively, the way she used to when she was small, and I'd get hurt doing yard work. But Brandon smoothly stepped between us, blocking her path with his body while maintaining that perfect mask of false concern. He stumbled coming up the steps, Brandon said with practiced calm, his voice dripping with manufactured sympathy. I tried to warn him about the wet porch, but you know how stubborn he gets about accepting help. I stared at him in complete disbelief, my mouth falling open at the brazen lie. "That's not what happened, Emily," I said, my voice shaking with pain and outrage. He slammed it deliberately when I was trying to come inside. Brandon wrapped his arm protectively around my daughter's shoulders, playing the caring husband role perfectly for her benefit. "Honey, he's getting confused again," Brandon said softly, shaking his head with fake sadness. "It happens at his age. The poor guy probably doesn't even remember stumbling." I watched helplessly as doubt crept into Emily's eyes like poison spreading through clear water, replacing her initial panic with uncertainty. After an hour of icing my throbbing hand at their kitchen table, Emily insisted on driving me home through the continuing downpour. The rain drummed steadily against the windshield as we sat in complete, uncomfortable silence. I could feel her pulling away from me with each passing mile, her mind clearly wrestling with whether to believe her husband or her father. My chest ached with something much deeper than physical pain, the sharp, devastating sting of betrayal by the person I loved most in this world. Every few minutes, she'd glance nervously at my swollen fingers with a mixture of genuine concern and growing suspicion. The silence stretched between us like a chasm that seemed to widen with each block we traveled. "Dad," she finally whispered as we pulled into my driveway, her voice barely audible over the rain. "Maybe you should try to be more careful when you visit us, okay? And maybe you should start using that walker the doctor mentioned last year." Walker? I hadn't used a walker in my entire 72 years of life, had never even owned one. But I could see in her troubled expression that she'd already decided I was the problem, that age was making me clumsy and forgetful. "Sure, sweetheart," I replied, forcing what I hoped was a reassuring smile. As I watched her taillights disappear into the gray afternoon, I muttered to my empty house, "This isn't over, Brandon." Alone on my living room couch that evening, I replayed the afternoon's events over and over in my mind like a broken record. The deliberate, calculated force of that door slamming shut. The cold satisfaction I'd seen flickering in Brandon's dark eyes. The smooth, practiced way he'd immediately started rewriting history before the pain had even fully registered in my brain. This wasn't the first time he'd shown his true colors around me, just the first time he'd escalated to actual physical violence. I sat there remembering countless family dinner conversations where he'd cut me off mid-sentence, rolled his eyes dismissively at my stories about teaching, or made snide comments about old people not knowing when to quit, while staring directly at me. For 5 long years, I'd endured his subtle disrespect and growing hostility, always biting my tongue for Emily's sake. I taught high school history for 37 years before retiring. And if there was one crucial lesson I'd learned from dealing with classroom bullies, it was this simple truth. Bullies only stop their behavior when they finally face real consequences for their actions. I'd spent my entire career teaching students that negative patterns repeat themselves endlessly unless someone brave enough steps up to break the destructive cycle. Brandon thought I was just a harmless, weak old man who would accept his escalating abuse quietly and gratefully. He was about to learn exactly how wrong that assumption was. Monday morning found me downtown at the Radio Shack on Broad Street, purchasing a small digital voice recorder that would fit easily in my jacket pocket. Nothing too fancy or expensive, just a reliable device small enough to hide, but powerful enough to capture crystal-clear audio evidence. The teenage clerk behind the counter looked bored and distracted as he mechanically explained the various features, but I listened to every word with the focused attention I'd once given to lesson planning. This little electronic device would become my insurance policy, my secret weapon in the war Brandon had declared on me. It holds up to 8 full hours of continuous recording, the kid said, demonstrating the simple red button controls with practiced efficiency. Just press this to start, press again to stop. Super easy, even for. He caught himself before finishing that sentence, but I knew what he'd been about to say. Even for old people like you. I tested the device twice in the store, making sure I completely understood every function and button. The next time I visited Emily's house, I'd be fully prepared for whatever cruelty Brandon decided to dish out. Brandon had been showing his true, ugly face for years, always thinking no one would ever call him out on his behavior. But teachers are naturally patient people who know how to gather evidence methodically. We understand how to wait for exactly the right moment to reveal uncomfortable truths. 3 days later, I returned to Emily's house for our regularly scheduled Sunday dinner, the tiny recorder tucked safely in my jacket pocket like a hidden ace. My heart pounded nervously as I pressed the small red button, while Brandon answered the front door with his usual look of barely concealed annoyance. "Oh great, he's back again," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for the sensitive device to catch every syllable perfectly. During dinner, he made an elaborate show of cutting my steak into smaller pieces, as if I were a helpless child who couldn't handle a knife. "Guess that arthritis is finally winning the battle, huh, Bobby?" he said with mock sympathy that fooled no one except possibly Emily. "Maybe it's time to seriously consider one of those assisted living places. There are some really nice facilities where they help old folks who can't take care of themselves properly anymore." Emily forced a nervous, uncomfortable laugh, clearly sensing the tension but unwilling to defend me against her husband's cruel implications. I stayed perfectly calm, chewing slowly and methodically, letting him continue talking and digging his own verbal grave. Every single cruel word, every cutting remark, every subtle insult was being recorded with perfect digital clarity, building my case one devastating comment at a time. "I'm managing just fine on my own," I replied mildly, keeping my voice steady. Brandon smirked with obvious satisfaction. "Sure you are, Bobby. That's exactly why you're always having these little accidents lately, right?" The following week, I brought over a cardboard box filled with Emily's old baby clothes that I'd carefully saved in my attic for years, hoping someday for grandchildren. My grandson was crying upstairs in his nursery, and my grandfather's instincts kicked in automatically as I moved toward the staircase to help comfort him. "Don't you dare touch him." Brandon barked sharply, physically blocking my path with his body like a security guard. "You'll drop him with those shaky old hands of yours, and then what? Emily, your dad shouldn't be around the baby without supervision anymore." The words hit me like a vicious slap across the face, cutting deeper than any physical blow could have. I'd raised Emily perfectly well as a single father after her mother died, had never dropped or accidentally hurt a child in my entire life. But Brandon was systematically painting me as incompetent, dangerous, and unfit to be around my own flesh and blood. Emily froze halfway up the stairs, visibly caught between her natural desire to protect her child and her equally strong instinct to defend her father from such harsh accusations. "Brandon, that seems a bit harsh," she said weakly, her voice lacking any real conviction or strength. "Harsh? I'm just being realistic about the situation," Brandon shot back immediately. "Look at his hands, still swollen and shaky from his last little accident. What happens if he has another one of his episodes while he's holding our son?" The hidden recorder in my pocket was capturing every cruel syllable, every calculated insult. I was methodically building a comprehensive library of his true character, one recorded conversation at a time. Soon enough, Emily would finally hear exactly what her husband really thought about her beloved father. That night around 10 o'clock, my phone rang with Emily's number displayed on the caller ID. Her voice trembled with uncertainty and confusion as she asked the question I'd been dreading since Saturday's incident. "Dad, about what happened with the door this weekend. Brandon keeps saying you're misremembering things again. He's genuinely worried about your memory, and honestly, so am I." My chest physically tightened with heartbreak and disappointment. My own daughter, the little girl I'd raised alone and sacrificed everything for, was now questioning my mental capacity based entirely on her manipulative husband's calculated lies. "Emily, sweetheart, I don't forget something like someone deliberately slamming a door on my hand," I said firmly but gently. "That kind of pain creates a very clear, permanent memory." The silence stretched between us across the phone line like a vast, unbridgeable chasm. "But Dad, why would Brandon want to hurt you? He has no reason to be cruel. That just doesn't make sense to me." I could hear the genuine confusion and doubt in her voice, the way she was desperately trying to convince herself that her husband couldn't possibly be capable of such calculated cruelty toward an elderly man. "Honey, people often show completely different faces to different people in their lives," I explained patiently. "You see the Brandon who loves you and treats you well, but I see someone else entirely when you're not around to witness his behavior." She went quiet for a long, uncomfortable moment. "Dad, would you please consider seeing Dr. Martinez about your memory, just to put everyone's minds at ease?" The request felt like a knife twisting slowly in my chest, but I knew arguing would only make things worse. "If that's what you need me to do," I whispered sadly. 2 weeks later, I decided to take the initiative and invited them both to my house for Sunday dinner, playing the part of the gracious, welcoming host perfectly. What Brandon didn't know or suspect was that I'd spent the morning carefully hiding voice recorders in both my kitchen and living room, positioned to capture conversations from multiple angles. As Emily helped me set the table with her grandmother's china, Brandon wandered around my house with obvious disdain and poorly concealed disgust. "This whole place smells like old people and mothballs," he muttered to Emily when he thought I was out of earshot in the kitchen. "When are you finally going to convince him to move somewhere more appropriate for someone his age?" I served the pot roast I'd been famous for among all of Emily's childhood friends, the same beloved recipe my late wife had perfected through years of trial and error. Brandon took exactly one bite, made an exaggerated face of displeasure, and set down his fork with theatrical disgust. "Kind of bland and overcooked, isn't it? Maybe your taste buds are going along with everything else that's failing." Emily shot him a sharp warning look across the table, but as usual, she said absolutely nothing in my defense, choosing silence over confrontation. I smiled pleasantly and continued eating my perfectly seasoned meal, knowing that every cruel insult and cutting remark was being captured with perfect clarity for posterity. The arrogant fool was literally digging his own grave with his venomous words, creating the evidence that would eventually destroy his carefully maintained facade. Brandon thought he was so clever, so untouchable in his cruelty, but every syllable was being documented and preserved. As Emily served her famous apple pie for dessert, Brandon leaned close to her ear and whispered what he undoubtedly thought was a completely private comment between husband and wife. But I positioned myself at exactly the right angle, and the strategically hidden recorder caught every single word with perfect clarity. "Your dad is getting really pathetic to watch, Emily. Look at him sitting there. Can barely hold his fork steady anymore. How much longer do we realistically have to keep pretending this slow decline is normal or acceptable?" Emily's face instantly went pale, her hands trembling slightly as she set down the silver pie server on the antique serving tray. I pretended not to have heard anything, maintaining my pleasant expression while internally celebrating this perfect piece of evidence. This was exactly the kind of damning proof I needed. Brandon revealing his true, cruel feelings when he believed no one else could hear him. I made a careful mental note of the exact timestamp for later reference when I transferred this recording to my growing digital collection. Brandon thought he was so incredibly clever, manipulating my daughter against me with whispered poison and calculated lies. But every single word he spoke was steadily building an ironclad case that would eventually expose him for exactly what he really was deep down: a heartless, manipulative man who genuinely enjoyed tormenting a vulnerable elderly father-in-law for his own twisted amusement. His arrogance would ultimately become his complete downfall, and I was going to make sure of it. The very next day, I drove across town to the Best Buy electronics store and purchased a small security camera cleverly disguised as an ordinary digital clock. The helpful salesperson patiently explained how the device connected wirelessly to my smartphone, allowing me to record everything that happened in my living room remotely. I positioned it carefully on my fireplace mantle, angling it precisely to capture the entire seating area where Brandon typically made his most cutting and cruel remarks during family visits. The red recording light was completely hidden behind the digital display, invisible to anyone unless they knew exactly where to look for it. If Brandon thought he could continue his systematic gaslighting campaign against me with complete impunity, he was about to discover that modern technology was firmly on my side. I spent the entire afternoon testing the device repeatedly, making absolutely sure the video quality was crystal clear and the audio pickup was sharp enough to catch whispered conversations. My late wife had always lovingly teased me about being too trusting and too willing to give people the benefit of the doubt, even when they clearly didn't deserve it. But teaching teenagers for nearly 4 decades had finally taught me the hard lesson that some people only respond to absolutely irrefutable proof of their bad behavior. Brandon was about to get exactly that kind of undeniable evidence presented to him in the most public and humiliating way possible. The days of his cruel manipulation and systematic abuse were numbered, whether he realized it yet or not. When they visited the following Sunday for our regular family dinner, Brandon walked straight past me without any acknowledgement or greeting, muttering just loud enough for the perfectly positioned hidden camera to catch. Why do we keep wasting our time coming to this depressing old place? The sooner he's safely locked away in a nursing home, the better off everyone will be. During dessert, he launched into what he probably thought was harmless, good-natured teasing designed to amuse Emily. You know, Bobby, most people your age have finally figured out when it's time to step back gracefully and let the younger generation take over the important decisions. He gestured around my comfortable living room with theatrical disgust and obvious disdain. This whole sad setup is pretty pathetic, don't you think? A lonely old man desperately clinging to an independence he lost years ago but refuses to admit. Emily laughed weakly and nervously, shooting uncomfortable glances between us while clearly wishing she were anywhere else. I remained perfectly calm and collected, even graciously offering him seconds on the homemade apple pie I'd spent hours preparing. The strategically placed camera was recording everything with perfect clarity, his contemptuous sneer, his dismissive body language, and most importantly, the genuine cruelty that flickered in his eyes whenever Emily's attention was directed elsewhere. That night, I sat in my study reviewing the high-definition footage and saw something that genuinely chilled me to the bone. Pure, undisguised hatred in Brandon's expression whenever my daughter wasn't looking directly at him. This wasn't just casual disrespect or mild irritation. This was deep, personal animosity. The following Tuesday afternoon, I was peacefully watering my prized rose garden when I overheard Brandon having an agitated cell phone conversation in Emily's driveway next door. He was speaking loudly and clearly upset about some workplace situation, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. "Look, the old man's situation is getting really annoying and complicated," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the fence. "Emily's way too soft and emotional to make the hard decisions that need to be made here. But honestly, guys his age don't exactly have long shelf lives anyway. Actuarial tables don't lie. Once he's permanently out of the picture, things will be dramatically simpler and easier around here." My blood ran completely cold as the full implications of his words sank in. He wasn't just being casually cruel for his own amusement anymore. He was actively hoping for and planning around my death, like it was an inevitable business transaction. I quickly and quietly pulled out my own digital recorder and managed to capture the rest of his callous conversation about my mortality. This was no longer about simple disrespect, casual cruelty, or even systematic emotional abuse. Brandon was literally discussing my death like a logistical problem to be solved, calculating how much easier and more convenient his life would become once I was permanently gone. I stood there among my carefully tended roses, listening in growing horror as my own son-in-law casually discussed how much more pleasant and manageable his life would be once I was dead and buried. That single recorded conversation would become the absolute centerpiece of my comprehensive evidence collection, the smoking gun that would expose his true character to everyone who mattered. My next-door neighbor, Mrs. Caldwell, had been quietly observing the increasingly tense family dynamics for several months with growing concern. She approached me while I was checking my mailbox one afternoon, her weathered face creased with genuine worry and compassion. "Bobby, I hope you don't mind me asking such a personal question, but is everything all right with your family situation? I've noticed you seem genuinely upset and shaken after your daughter's visits lately." I carefully considered how much personal information to share, then decided on a carefully edited but truthful version of recent events. "Brandon can be quite difficult sometimes, Mrs. Caldwell. He doesn't seem to have much respect or patience for older people in general." Mrs. Caldwell nodded knowingly, her expression growing more serious. "I've heard him shouting and carrying on from your front porch before, Bobby. The way he talks to you isn't right or acceptable from anyone, especially family." Her immediate validation meant absolutely everything to me in that moment. I wasn't imagining the systematic abuse or going crazy from loneliness. Other people could clearly see it too and were genuinely concerned. "Would you possibly be willing to write down what you've observed over the past few months?" I asked carefully, not wanting to pressure her, but hoping she'd agree. She nodded immediately, without hesitation. "That man has a genuinely mean streak, Bobby, and I've seen exactly how he treats you when he thinks no one else is paying attention. It's completely unacceptable behavior. Having credible witnesses to corroborate my recordings would strengthen my case immeasurably when the time came for public confrontation." Emily came to visit me alone on a quiet Thursday evening, looking genuinely exhausted and deeply troubled by something weighing heavily on her mind. We sat together in my comfortable kitchen with steaming cups of chamomile tea, and for the first time in many months, she seemed like my little girl again instead of Brandon's suspicious, guarded wife. "Dad," she said quietly, staring down into her cup, "sometimes Brandon genuinely scares me. Not physically, but the way he talks about other people, the cold anger that creeps into his voice." My heart ached with sympathy for her obvious distress, but I forced myself to stay calm and measured. This was exactly the opening I'd been patiently waiting for, but I couldn't push too hard or too fast without risking her retreat. "What specific kinds of things does he say that worry you, sweetheart?" I asked gently. She continued staring into her teacup as if searching for answers. "He gets so incredibly angry about small, insignificant things that shouldn't matter. And he talks about you sometimes like you're not even a real person with feelings anymore." I reached across the small table and squeezed her trembling hand gently. "Emily, I want you to remember this exact feeling and this moment of clarity, okay? Remember that you noticed something was fundamentally wrong with his behavior. One day, that awareness and intuition might become very important for both of us." She nodded slowly, tears beginning to form in her tired eyes. "I love him so much, Dad, but sometimes I honestly don't recognize the man I married anymore." Christmas dinner at Emily's beautifully decorated house became the dramatic turning point I'd been patiently waiting for all year. I brought my beloved grandson a small wooden train I'd spent weeks carefully carving and painting myself, complete with tiny bright red details and perfectly smooth wheels. The moment I handed the handcrafted gift to the delighted little boy, Brandon absolutely exploded with disproportionate rage. "Don't give him that dangerous piece of junk," he shouted at the top of his lungs. "He could get painful splinters, or choke on loose paint chips, or cut himself on sharp edges. What were you thinking, bringing unsafe toys into our house?" The entire crowded room went completely silent, every conversation stopping mid-sentence. Emily's relatives, her aunt, uncle, and various cousins, stared at Brandon in complete shock and disbelief. My innocent grandson reached eagerly for the carefully crafted train, but Brandon roughly snatched it away from the child's small hands. "This is exactly what I've been trying to tell everyone," he continued, his voice rising to near hysteria levels. "Unsafe decisions, no common sense whatsoever, complete lack of judgment. He simply cannot be trusted around children anymore under any circumstances." I sat perfectly still in my chair, my hand casually resting on the recorder in my jacket pocket. This explosive public outburst was actually better than anything I could have possibly planned or orchestrated myself. Emily's entire extended family was witnessing his calculated cruelty firsthand, finally seeing the real man I'd been describing and complaining about for months. Her uncle leaned forward and whispered loudly enough for everyone at the table to hear clearly. "He shouldn't be talking to you like that, Bobby. That's completely uncalled for and totally inappropriate behavior." After the shocking Christmas dinner incident, various family members quietly approached me throughout the remainder of the evening, each one expressing genuine concern and offering support. Emily's aunt pulled me aside privately in the kitchen while we were cleaning up. "Bobby, I had absolutely no idea that Brandon treated you this way on a regular basis. We've all noticed his generally unpleasant attitude over the years, but tonight's explosion was absolutely shocking and completely unacceptable." Her cousin nodded emphatically in agreement. "The way he spoke to you about that beautiful wooden toy was genuinely cruel and heartless. Anyone could see that you put tremendous love and effort into making that special gift." I suddenly realized with growing hope that I wasn't fighting this increasingly difficult battle completely alone anymore. Other people could finally see Brandon's true, ugly nature clearly, and they were genuinely willing to speak up about it publicly. Over the next several days, I received concerned phone calls from 3 different family members, each offering their support and expressing serious concerns about how Brandon consistently treated me. I began carefully documenting these supportive conversations, adding detailed witness statements to my rapidly growing file of damning evidence. Each person who spoke up made my case significantly stronger and more credible. Brandon's carefully maintained public mask was finally slipping in front of other people, and they were starting to notice and comment on the cruel man I'd been dealing with privately for years. His days of unchecked abuse were finally numbered. Spring arrived with warmer weather, and Emily decided to host a backyard barbecue for friends and neighbors to celebrate the season. Brandon had been steadily drinking beer throughout the sunny afternoon, and alcohol always made his usually careful filter disappear completely. As I helped Emily arrange various dishes on the picnic table, he lounged arrogantly in a lawn chair, holding court with several neighbors and friends. "You know what I honestly don't understand about today's society," he said loudly, gesturing dramatically toward me with his half-empty beer bottle. "Why old people can't just accept gracefully when they're way past their expiration date and should step aside. Look at Bobby over there. Probably hasn't contributed anything genuinely useful to society in over a decade, but still hanging around like dead weight that everyone has to carry." The entire backyard full of people fell into stunned, uncomfortable silence. Mrs. Caldwell audibly gasped in shock and dismay. Emily's face turned bright red with acute embarrassment and shame. I kept calmly arranging the potato salad as if I hadn't heard his cruel words, but my hidden recorder was capturing every single syllable for posterity. One of the neighbors, a man I barely knew beyond casual waves, stood up from his chair and said firmly, "That was completely out of line and inappropriate, Brandon. Bobby's a genuinely good man and your elder. You need to show some basic respect and human decency." The social pressure was finally building against him from multiple directions, and his reputation in the community was beginning to crumble under the weight of his own arrogance and cruelty. The following week, I asked Emily to come to my house alone for a serious conversation that could no longer be delayed. My hands trembled slightly with nervous anticipation as I pulled out my laptop computer and the thick folder of evidence I'd been meticulously compiling for months. "Sweetheart, I need you to listen to something very important, and I need you to listen with a completely open mind," I said gently but firmly. Her eyes widened with surprise and growing apprehension as I played the first crystal-clear recording, Brandon's voice unmistakably mocking me, calling me pathetic, casually discussing my eventual death like it was welcome news. She immediately pressed her hand to her mouth in shock, tears forming in her eyes. "He actually said that? When did he say those horrible things?" I played another devastating clip, then another and another. With each recorded conversation, I watched her face transform from initial disbelief to gradual recognition to complete horror at the truth. "Dad, I honestly don't understand any of this. Why would he say such cruel things about you?" The genuine pain and confusion in her voice broke my heart into pieces, but I knew she desperately needed to hear the complete, unvarnished truth about her husband's character. Because this is exactly who he really is when you're not around to see it, sweetheart, I explained gently. This is how he talks about your father when he thinks no one is listening or paying attention. She sat in stunned, devastated silence, staring at the laptop screen as if it might somehow change what she'd heard with her own ears. I carefully opened the thick manila folder and methodically spread its damning contents across my kitchen table like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. Audio transcripts printed in black ink and highlighted in yellow marker. High-resolution still photographs from the hidden camera showing Brandon's contemptuous, sneering expressions. Detailed witness statements from concerned neighbors and shocked family members. Bank records clearly showing money he'd borrowed from me over the years and conveniently never repaid. This systematic pattern of abuse has been going on for 5 full years, Emily. I documented absolutely everything because I knew that someday you'd need to see the complete, undeniable truth about who you married. She picked up the printed photographs with visibly shaking hands, studying Brandon's face and expressions she'd never witnessed before. He looks so genuinely hateful and cruel, she whispered in disbelief. This is really how he looks at you when I'm not watching? I nodded sadly, wishing I could spare her this pain. I'm truly sorry you have to see all of this evidence, but you deserve to know exactly who you're living with and trusting. She stared at a particularly damning transcript of him discussing my death as good news, her tears falling steadily onto the paper. What kind of person talks about their father-in-law dying like it's something to celebrate? The question hung heavy in the air between us like a dark cloud. Someone who sees people as obstacles instead of human beings with feelings. I replied softly, my heart breaking for her obvious distress and shattered illusions. Emily went home that evening and immediately confronted Brandon with everything she'd learned about his true character. My phone rang at 11:30 that night. Her voice was completely shaken and filled with fury I'd never heard before. Dad, he called me crazy and delusional. He said you're deliberately manipulating me with fake recordings and fabricated evidence, and that I'm being completely ridiculous and gullible for believing you over him. I'd fully expected this exact reaction from Brandon. Abusers and manipulators always double down aggressively when they're finally exposed and cornered. What exactly did he say to you, sweetheart? I asked calmly. She was crying openly now, her voice breaking with emotion. He said you're just a bitter, lonely old man trying to break up our marriage because you can't stand that I chose him over you. He claimed the recordings were probably edited or taken completely out of context to make him look bad. I took a deep, steadying breath, remaining calm in the center of this emotional storm. Emily, I want you to stop arguing with him about any of this. Just watch him carefully now. Listen closely to how he talks to you when he thinks you're doubting him. People always reveal their true selves when they feel genuinely threatened. She was quiet for several long moments. Dad, he's angrier than I've ever seen him in our entire relationship. It's honestly almost scary to witness. The carefully maintained mask was finally coming off completely, and his true nature was being revealed. The final, dramatic confrontation came at Emily's birthday party the following month, surrounded by friends and family. I'd been reluctantly invited, and I could feel the thick tension the moment I walked through their beautifully decorated front door. Brandon had clearly been drinking heavily to cope with stress, and his usual careful facade was rapidly crumbling. When Emily casually mentioned that I'd helped her pick out her new dress, he completely exploded in front of everyone. Your father is a manipulative liar and a troublemaker, he shouted at the top of his lungs. He's been systematically poisoning you against me with his crazy conspiracy theories and fake recordings. He's trying to destroy our marriage because he can't stand that you love someone more than him. The entire room went completely silent in shock. Children stopped playing mid-game. Adults stared in disbelief at his unhinged outburst. Emily stood frozen in place, her face pale with humiliation and dawning realization. I remained perfectly calm and reached slowly into my jacket pocket. I have all the recordings right here. Brandon, I said quietly but clearly. Would you like me to play them for everyone at this party? His face turned completely white as he suddenly realized exactly what I was holding in my hand. Every single person in that crowded room was about to hear exactly what kind of man he really was behind closed doors. I calmly pulled out my smartphone and connected it wirelessly to Emily's expensive Bluetooth speaker system. This recording is from 3 months ago. I announced clearly to the silent, stunned room. Brandon's own voice filled every corner with perfect clarity. Your dad is getting really pathetic to watch. How much longer do we have to keep pretending this is normal? Audible gasps echoed around the decorated living room. I played the next devastating clip without hesitation. The old man won't last much longer anyway. Once he's out of the picture, things will be dramatically simpler. The color completely drained from Brandon's face as his own recorded words condemned him beyond any possibility of denial. Emily covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming down her cheeks as the truth hit her like a physical blow. Her relatives and friends stared at Brandon with expressions of complete disgust and disbelief. That's enough, he shouted desperately, lunging toward my phone. But Emily's uncle quickly stepped between us, his face hard with anger. No, let him finish playing everything. We all need to hear exactly what kind of man you really are. I played one more particularly damning recording, Brandon calling me dead weight at the barbecue. The room erupted in angry whispers, shocked exclamations, and disgusted murmurs. Brandon stood there completely exposed, his years of cruelty revealed to everyone who mattered to Emily. There was absolutely no denying it now, no rewriting history, no gaslighting anyone. His own voice had sealed his fate permanently. Brandon's face contorted with desperate rage as he realized his entire world was collapsing around him in real time. You set me up, you manipulative old bastard, he screamed, spittle flying from his mouth. This is entrapment. This is a legal recording. But the irreversible damage was already done, and everyone could see his true character clearly. Emily stood up slowly, her voice steady despite her tears. Get out, she said firmly, pointing toward the door. Get out of my house right now and don't come back. He tried frantically to argue, to explain, to justify his recorded words, but absolutely no one was listening to his desperate excuses anymore. The party guests began filing out quietly, several stopping to apologize to me personally and offer Emily their support and encouragement. Brandon grabbed his keys from the entrance table and stormed toward the door, but turned back one final time with pure hatred in his eyes. You'll regret this, Bobby. Both of you will regret this decision for the rest of your lives. He slammed the front door so violently it rattled the windows and shook the walls. Emily immediately collapsed into my arms, sobbing with a mixture of relief and devastation. My precious grandson crawled over and hugged my leg tightly, still clutching the wooden train Brandon had tried to take away from him. As I held my daughter and grandchild close, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, genuine peace and vindication. The truth was finally free, and justice was beginning to take its course. 3 weeks later, divorce papers were served at Brandon's apartment. He tried to fight the proceedings, claiming I'd manipulated Emily against him, but the evidence spoke louder than his protests. The recordings were admissible, the witness statements compelling, and his own behavior during the custody hearings sealed his fate. Emily and my grandson moved back into my house temporarily while she rebuilt her life. The sounds of laughter and cartoons filled my quiet halls again, replacing years of loneliness with the warmth of family. My hand had healed completely, but the deeper wounds, the doubt between Emily and me, were finally mending too. As I sat in my rocking chair one evening, my grandson playing with his wooden train at my feet, Emily looked up from her laptop, where she was job hunting. Dad, I'm so sorry I doubted you. I should have seen what he was doing. I squeezed her hand gently. The important thing is that you see it now, I replied. In the distance, I could hear Brandon's voice on her voicemail, still trying to manipulate his way back into our lives. But his words had no power anymore. I leaned back in my chair and whispered to myself, checkmate.